Hi everyone, welcome back. Entropy here again today with our second advanced guide. It's been a long time since the first MLB one, and I'm really excited to finally be able to do another one. I do apologize for the long wait. It does take quite a bit of time to compile this, and also to do some research as well as just get a lot of gameplay myself, so I get some wisdom and experience with it. And so without further ado, let's talk about the Perfect Raizer. So let's talk about the list and my current standing with the deck. I started playing this deck at around Legend 120-ish. So near the end of last season, I was just comfortable with my position, so I was going to experiment with different decks. And I played a lot of Perfect Raizer in the second and third season, the Kagero season and the OTT season, and it just plays really well. And there are some alarming issues with the deck. The support for it isn't really there, specifically not a lot of direct support, and it doesn't, like, the rear guards don't really hit numbers, but it still functions really well. So on the left, it's largely changed from the previous season. I've got my last copy of Asura Kaiser, so stuff like that. Let's just talk about the list real quick. For the grade 1 slot, you play your 4 PGs, your 8 Raizers, and your 1 flex spot, Shout or other options are available. I play Shout because it helps you filter out the cards that you don't need. Specifically the grade 3s, and gets you to your other pieces faster, your Raizer pieces specifically. For your grade 2 slot, you play the 7 Raizers. This is pretty general. Some people play 8. I wouldn't play less than 7. I think the extra copy of the 8K is a bit too much, because it honestly doesn't have a lot of special functions other than being a ride target. And with more than 50% of your grade 2 lineup being a Raizer, and the other options being, pretty all really viable, like Brutal Jack. It's just a really great, distribution, and I'm really comfortable with it. There are arguments for playing 4 Brutal Jack, but the counterblast limitation actually really hindered me sometimes, especially since I don't play a lot of counterchargers, only the grade 3 ones. And then the Kirara is actually really surprisingly useful, because sometimes you just miss the key pieces, and you just need to draw into them. Or you're late game and you don't have a lot of hand size, because Nova Grapplers don't really have the draw power to facilitate its aggressiveness, sustain it into the late game. So Kirara helps you do that. Lastly, for the grade 3 slots, I play 4 Perfect Raizer because it's perfectly fine. For Asura Kaiser as your backup grade 3, you play 4 VM Flipper because you kind of blast quite a lot with Kirara, Brutal Jack, and Perfect Raizer himself. And then 1 Cosmo Lord. Cosmo Lord is quite flexible. Don't rely on it too much, I'd say. It's really enticing to just tap all your Raizers, rest them, and then scoop them up for Perfect Raizer, and then keep it in the front row. But sometimes that extra power doesn't really do much in the early game. So yeah, let's talk about the Mulligan. I think this is pretty general for people who are experienced with it or play against them. Generally, you just want your Raizers and PGs. The reason why I'm willing to Mulligan for a PG compared to like a deck like MLB, because their functions are similar, right? A crit pressure deck that runs really fast, is that MLB actually has more options to draw and filter, while Raizers don't. Like MLB, you can play 4 Lians, but Raizers, you can't really play 4 Shouts unless you're willing to sacrifice that consistency with Perfect Raizer himself. And with cards like Trans Raizer, yes, you do filter out your deck, but you can also call out your PGs. In Royals, you don't really have that issue. So yeah, and also with so many other crit pressure decks in the metagame right now, like Perfect Raizer himself, Majesty Lord Blaster, Shadow Paladins with PBD and PBO. It's always handy to have 1 PG, but I generally still prioritize the Raizers and then the PG. At first, when I started playing this deck, I prioritized Perfect Raizer a bit too much. You honestly don't need to. Just mulligan for your grade 1s and grade 2s. There's so many good grade 3s and Nova Grapplers that you can play around with. So it's a flexible deck, and even if you get Perfect Raizer later into the game, you can still rewrite it, right? So let's talk about some tips and techniques that I found quite useful with my own gameplay. So let's talk about Battleraizer. I think this is your starter, and the one that I'm most comfortable with. There are other options that we will talk about later. So Battleraizer, it functions really well. It's a 3k booster. After you boost with it, it goes back into the deck. You draw one, and it acts as a stand trigger, right? So it helps facilitate the multi-attack that Raizer's, the system itself, doesn't really provide, since it's more of a crit pressure deck, Vanguard centric deck. And also it acts as a Raizer if you need it, for a Perfect Raizer himself. And so on your left side of Battleraizer, you see the two primary ride targets. You generally put Battleraizer in the middle column so that you don't have to overextend early game in order to ensure that you use the Battleraizer skill before you go into grade 3. And also it gives your Vanguard an extra buff to just attack without boost, right? The reason why I'd suggest you use Battlereizer's boost, the starting Vanguard's boost, on turn 2, is because, well, when you ride Perfect Raizer, you don't really want to scoop up that trigger. And also, if you scoop up the Battleraizer, well, sometimes you do have to if necessary. I would still do it because the crit pressure is so important, but generally I wouldn't, because the Battleraizer could draw into something else and still act as a trigger, right? There are quite a lot of Raizers in the deck that you could potentially draw into, so I'd rather do that. And it's a trigger. And then for Perfect Raizer, when you ride him, Counterblast 2, you get a Battleraizer, and it just gives you all the good stuff that we just talked about. And also, if necessary, you can use it as a resource to get into the crit pressure. That's basically it. So Asura Kaiser, why do we still play that? Well, some people say you should ride it when your opponent's at 5 damage, right? Because, well, when your opponent has PGs, you want to end the game. But if you have experience with the deck, I find myself rarely actually going into Asura Kaiser. That's because Perfect Raizer does what it needs to do perfectly well. It does the crit pressure, it damage denies, and it hits numbers. Think about it. Like, Asura Kaiser without a booster can't really hit the cross-ride numbers and the MLB numbers, 12k, 13k. So it means you're winning by a margin if you go into Asura Kaiser, is what I'm saying. Especially if your rear guards need to hit that number as well to proc the PGs, right? And especially if your opponent's not even at 5 damage. They're 4 damage, they get the plus 5k, right? 18, 17. It's hard to hit over that without a proper booster. And that usually means you're winning already. On the other hand, I see value in Asura Kaiser because, if your opponent has a lot of intercepts, that means your back row are not resting. So then you can still hit those like 17, 18k numbers. But yeah, in general, rarely ride into Asura Kaiser unless, the PG count and the intercept count is really high and you hit them to 5. And generally stay in Perfect Raizer. One last just comment is that, some people were like, oh, your opponent's at 5, just do whatever you want, right? Like, not necessarily. If your opponent doesn't have a PG, or if you think your opponent doesn't have PG, and you hit them with Perfect Raizer, right? Like, you don't ride it Asura Kaiser, you use it as a rear guard, or you keep it in your hand for later use. And if they don't have anything, well, it means that they just take damage, and you're just trying to get over that heal trigger, right? Because your opponent can still hit heals, and it's more damaging to your game if they hit a heal when you're on Asura Kaiser than on Perfect Raizer. Yeah. Okay, so another quick tip is the rise sequence. Like, as we mulligan, we see multiple risers in grade 1 and grade 2. Not grade 3. We only have Perfect Raizer. On grade 2, you want the 8k, not Trans Riser. Well, the 1k actually is quite substantial, and if you play it as a rear guard, it's just more valuable to play it as a rearguard later on to fetch other pieces. But I think the grade 1 slot is actually for more of a contention for which one to ride, right? Like in general, I like to think of it as if you go first or second. And that actually plays a big role in an aggro deck like this, right? Because if you think about it, like if you ride the 7k, if you go first, well, you have a 7k base, right? If you ride the 6k when you go first, that's a 6k, you can't attack with it, and it's more vulnerable. If you go second, then if you go with a 6k, then you can hit any grade 1 Vanguard without boost, right? You don't generally want to use your Battleraizer. But if you ride the 7k, then it provides you more defensive options when your opponent's on grade 2. So I generally want to bring that up because when I started playing this deck, I just mulligan for the 6k and not really the 7k. I kept it as rearguard. But the 6k boost and the 7k boost, they don't really play that big of a role, I'd argue. And the contention is mostly on which one to ride rather than which one to call it on a rearguard circle, because the grade 2 and grade 3 slots are quite effective at what they do already. And then next, let's talk about some matchups and look into how the metagame responds to Perfect Raizer. Perfect Raizer was top tier 1 for the previous seasons, side by side with Tsukiyomi and Good Stuff Kagero. So let's see how it's doing right now, right? And honestly, it's kind of rough. It's honestly kind of rough, right? Because if you look at it, your grade 1s are like 6k, 7ks, your grade 2s are like 7k, 8ks, and your grade 3s are 10k, 11ks, right? They don't really help you hit those magic numbers specifically. Like, you don't have a space for your 8ks, tough boys, and your grade 2 slot, sure, you have brutal jacks and stuff, but they require resources that eats itself into your other plays. So what are you supposed to do? Are you supposed to still damage deny MLB? Do you don't play your rear guards to dodge retire effects from shadows like Berserk Dragons and that's Kagero, but PBD and stuff? I'd say rush them down, but don't overextend. So what do I mean, right? Like, just talking about just now, you don't hit magic numbers already. So I generally try to just hit the 13k, 12k numbers on the rearguards, and then my Vanguard Perfect Raizer can hit the big numbers, right? Like, even if they hit a trigger, whether it's 22 or 23, your Perfect Raizer is 23, assuming you already have the crit pressure condition, right, for Raizers. So, rearguard hit into rearguard or rearguard hit into Vanguard, and then Vanguard hit Vanguard. And then you get over that threshold, and it's a more comfortable play rather than, going for maximum damage, right? Like 13, 18, and then 20, 23 or 28, right? Like, one damage trigger to just ruin your play. Not saying that you shouldn't consider it, like in some games you should, but just due to the nature of the lack of draw power and the high base defense that the meta provides these other clans, you just have to honestly be more careful than you were if you played Perfect Raizer in previous seasons, and just think about the long term, right? Like, just don't throw out everything and bash face. Like, the deck doesn't really function at that level anymore, and you need to put some thought into it. It's honestly tier 2, so it does take some effort to play, but it's still really rewarding, and you can steal games really, really fast. So let's talk about other options, right? Like, what other alternatives are there? There are like 6 general options that I've played around with or thought about. So the first one is the Death Armies on the left side. The Death Armies, they're good. They give you the multi-attack option as a 7k and 9k restander. But in the grade 1 slot, you don't have a lot of flexible spots. Are you going to replace the Shout? Are you going to replace the Raizers for consistency? Are you going to play less than 4 RPG? I'm not comfortable with that. You can try experimenting with that, but honestly, I don't think it works that well. Grade 2 Death Army Lady, I think she's more viable. But again, The question is, well, it's not going to hit numbers anyways, right? Like, it's rarely 9K grade 3s. It's rarely 10K grade 3s. Honestly, it's rarely 11K grade 3s anymore. 12K, 13K, once they hit 18, like, like, it's too situational. It's too rare that the death armies give you that extra oomph to do anything, right? And then, lastly, Mr. Invincible. Some people talked about their winning image, and they talked about Mr. Invincible being a potential option late game. I honestly disagree with it. Personally speaking, the 10K base really hurts. The unflipping effect rarely happens, and you have to hit to proc it, right, to activate it. But I do see some value in the thought, because Perfect Raizer lets you scoop up souls, and you get that soul condition already. With your late game, you generally are already at heavy damage, so you could activate it. But then again, why don't you just ride Asura Kaiser, right? Like, it's more of a budget option, Mr. Invincible, I feel. On the right side, the more viable options, I feel. The Grade 3 Searcher, if you don't have 4 Perfect Raizers, or you want the consistency of having Perfect Raizer over the raw value of Battleraizer, then do try that out. Murio, I think his name is. He works great. I used to play the deck with just 3 Perfect Raizers, and he does help you fetch your pieces. And the only bad thing about the Grade 3 Searchers in this game, I feel like, is that you're losing a trigger, and the Counterblast is still a hefty cost with the lack of unflippers. So if you do play it, consider playing the Grade 2. I think his name is Humpty Dumpty, the unflipper, over a card like Kirara, maybe. But yeah, try that out. See how you feel about it. I think it's honestly a viable option. Is it the best one? You gotta test it out yourself. Next is a Boomerang Shooter. I talked about this at in the MLB video. It's great. If you see a lot of MLBs, which honestly this season I don't, because I'm facing a lot of VP farmers. But when you do, and when you want to play competitively, do consider playing the Boomerang Shooter over over the Brutal Jack or the Kirara, because your opponent losing that Wingo Brave, or even the Conroe maybe, right? Because nobody really expects the Boomerang Shooter. Really hurts their game. So do consider that. And lastly, Beast 80s, right? Beast 80, Asura Dragon. And let's talk about this one. Hybrid decks, personally, as we talked about the winning image video, I am not a big fan of them. They make your goal of the deck less transparent. It's less consistent, and it means more thinking during the game. That really hurts, because when you're thinking a lot about your own gameplay, it means you can't consider your opponent's gameplay, right? You can't pick up on the signals and how your opponent's playing around with their deck as much, because you're too busy minding your own business, really. So this is a deck list from Game With. You play your Beast 80 cards, the Grade 1, the Grade 2, the Grade 3, of course. But as you can see, in order to facilitate the Beast 80 engine, you sacrifice a lot of consistency on the Raizer system, right? You don't play the 6K Raizer anymore. You don't play the 8K Grade 2 Raizer anymore. So even if you do get Perfect Raizer, is it that consistent? I don't think so. I honestly don't feel like it is. You also lose the Unflipper, and this list plays 4 Brutal Jacks and 4 Perfect Raizers, and they're quite Counterblast heavy. So it's going to be more thinking involved every single turn. But let's talk about the positives, right? Like, the positive is the flexibility, right? Like, when you're on Grade 3, you have Perfect Raizer, which is a great card. It's just a great crit pressure. And then you have your Azure Dragons and Asura Kaisers to do the multi-attack. So it's flexible how you want to play around your opponent's plays. And then adaptability, right? Again, I think for this kind of deck, you really have to think what you're going to do if you go first or second. And Game With actually has a great discussion about this. Like, okay, if you go first or second, Are you going with the Raizer engine, or are you going with the Beast 80 engine, right? Because the Beast 80 engine requires it to hit your opponent's Vanguard, if I'm correct, or even if it just requires to hit, right? That's quite conditional. And then you check top 5 to get an Asura Dragon. And as we talked about with the Grade 3 Searcher, losing a trigger is quite detrimental in this game. Yes, Asura Dragon skill is pretty good. It's consistent, Persona Blast, right? Like, you don't have to drive check a Grade 3 like Asura Kaiser. But is it worth losing a trigger, draw trigger, or heal trigger over it? You need to test it. Like, I haven't really tested the deck, but I've seen gameplay, and I don't really feel like I'm not as comfortable with it as the pure build. Another thing is, right now, Asura Dragon isn't really in a good spot, right? As an 11k, Persona Blast stand 2, do you stand the front row? They can't really hit numbers. Do you stand one whole column? And so, the extra value, the trade-off between using a trigger, searching for a trigger, and then using that trigger to get one column to attack to hit numbers is rarely that significant. And that crit pressure from Perfect Raizer, and that consistent crit pressure from Perfect Raizer, generally outweighs the flexibility that this hybrid deck provides, in my opinion. So yeah, thank you so much. I made some assumptions, about like the positioning or some basic gameplay. If you are interested in seeing gameplay of this video, let me know. But honestly, I would redirect you to 50 cards. 50 cards is a great Novice player. He does test stuff other than Perfect Raizer. He hasn't really tested the hybrid build, I think, but he also tried out Cosmolords. Future Nova Grappler support is pretty iffy. I'm not really feeling Cosmolords myself. I don't think most people in the community are. But yeah, I think Novus has a lot of potential. You should still consider playing it, especially since I think a lot of players have easier accessibility to it. The pure Raizer build, honestly requires just a couple of rares and double rares, and a playset of Perfect Raizer. And even if you don't, play the Grade 3 Searcher and have some fun with it. It's definitely pretty interesting and a lot of fun. So I hope you enjoy this video. Please like, comment, share, and subscribe. I really appreciate your support. And to end the video, I just want to give you guys a reminder about the live stream that's coming up soon for the Shadow Paladin banner. Hope you guys look forward to that, and I'll see you next time. Bye.